Okay, just quickly as the chair, let me just brief everybody on what's gonna, you and everybody else on what's gonna happen. So you'll do your presentation, and then there'll be some direct conversation with the committee, and then we'll also open it up to the audience. If you all have comments or questions for his work, you're welcome to contribute those as well after the committee has duly grilled him. We'll save appreciations, so during that we'll ask you to just sort of comment specifically on his work, and then we'll step out again and have a conversation about the committee, and then we'll come back in and render a decision. Understood. Okay. All right, so it's your show.
Good morning, and everyone's been here for some time. So the title of my dissertation is Out of the Mouths of Babes, Hope and Hopelessness in Middle School Students of Color. I chose this title because I believe that young people have a great deal of insight in terms of how their level of hope is affected by the environments that they live in. This is an overview of the presentation. So the purpose of this study was to examine how social and environmental factors such as access to healthcare and jobs, exposure to violence, school climate, and relationships with adults affect hope levels, and how this relationship then affects academic achievement. The intent of this study was to hear the voices of young people that are exposed to toxic environments and gain their perspective as to what factors either encourage or diminish their level of hope. So in this study, hope was defined as a young person's ability to navigate their day-to-day lives based on their perceptions of what they believe they have control over, and then how these perceptions affect their ability to identify goals and move along viable pathways to make their goals a reality. So the problem. The research is clear that low-income students of color that have low levels of hope also have lower levels of academic achievement, lower levels of school engagement, are at greater risk for mental and physical health issues. And these disparities in academic achievement, health, and social mobility lie within upstream social inequalities, which then creates this continuous cycle of social inequality and hopelessness in communities of color. As a result, the evidence is clear. Black students are twice as likely to drop out of high school as white students, and Latino students are 3 times as likely to drop out of high school as white students. Black and Latino students have higher rates of being exposed to violent crimes, both as victims and perpetrators. Black and Latino students are least likely to be hired and lead the nation in unemployment rates. So the theory. So hope theory is a reciprocal hope theory, or hope defined, is rather a reciprocal interaction between agency and pathways. More specifically, agency is one's perceived ability to initiate and sustain movement along selected pathways toward a desired goal, and pathways is one's perceived capacity to formulate one or more behavioral strategies by which to arrive at desired goals. For example, if I were to speak to a young man and ask him what he wanted to be when he grew up, and his response to me was that he would like to be an attorney and that he has all confidence that he can do that, well, he's exhibited to me that he has some sense of agency. However, the pathways part comes in when he can then tell me, well, I know that I need to go to high school, I know I need to go to college, law school, and pass the bar, because he's telling me what the steps that he needs to take in order to meet his goal. However, Dr. Duncan Andrade cautions us against false hope, which is a radical distortion of the premise of hope, meaning that people who live in socially toxic environments have the same opportunities in their life as their wealthier and healthier counterparts, even though the evidence doesn't prove such. However, he offers us critical hope. And critical hope rejects the despair of hopelessness, and it demands a committed and active struggle against the evidence. The evidence being that our current education and social systems are not meeting the needs of our low-income communities. And so once we actively struggle against that, then we can change the deadly tides of wealth, inequality, group xenophobia, and personal despair. So in the literature, there were several key things. One, that hope has shown strong positive relationships to mental and physical health, meaning that those individuals who have higher hope levels are more likely to be more healthy, both physically and mentally. The research also tells us that individuals with high hope also have higher levels of academic achievement. This piece is extremely key. The research tells us that children who experience trauma during their early stages of development often struggle with language and communication skills, attentiveness to classroom tasks, regulating emotions, and curriculum engagement. It's very important to understand this because these are the exact concepts that we ask our students to do when they come to school. And so we know that if a student is living in a socially toxic environment, which increases the likelihood that they'll be exposed to traumatic events, then they will walk into the classroom with these things. And then we ask them to learn. High levels of school engagement has also been linked to high level of academic performance. Very simple. The more engaged a student is in the classroom, he or she is more likely to be successful academically. Additionally, school engagement is considered a reliable predictor of student achievement. So what did I want to know? I wanted to know what social and/or environmental factors influence hope levels among low-income Black and Latino 7th and 8th graders impacted by consistent levels of social inequality. More specifically, what factors in their lives either encourage hope and what factors diminish their hope. And then how this relationship is correlated with academic achievement. For my study, I used sequential exploratory mixed method research design. Essentially, I used quantitative and qualitative methods to conduct my research study. I selected 7th and 8th grade students that are considered Black and Latino and qualify for free or reduced price lunch. Specifically, 72 students. I administered the Children's Hope Scale, which was created by Charles Snyder in 1997. It's a series of 6 questions. Three of those questions tap into the agency that I spoke about earlier, and 3 tap into the pathways. Once I distributed that survey to each of the 72 students, I then purposefully selected 9 participants to interview for the study. The quantitative findings. So the average GPA for the 72 participants in the study was 2.63. The average hope score was 24.96. The average agency subscale score was 12.65, and average pathway subscale score was 12.35. The bottom of the screen shows you that students who fell between 11 and 21 were considered to have low hope, those between 22 and 27, average hope, those between 28 and 35, high hope.
Damien, could you explain to the audience the hope scale so we can interpret those numbers?
No problem. So, the hope scale has 6 questions. Okay. So, on each question, you can score between a 0, a 1, and a 4. Yeah, a 1 and a 4. And so what happens is that the overall, once you take those 6 questions, 6 times 6, you can either get a 1 or a 6. And so the highest score you can get on the hope scale would be 36. The lowest score that you would get on the hope scale is a 6, because there's 6 questions. And so essentially what I wanted to do was to figure out which students were in the upper 25th percentile, the lower 25th percentile, and which students fell within the average range. In terms of the subscales, the highest score that you could get on one particular subscale was 18. So we found that for this particular group of students, 12.65 was the average. Now when you look and you notice that 35 is a high score, even though you can get a 36, that's because none of the participants scored a 36 on the actual scale. So when I did my statistical analysis, it stopped at 35 as the high score. And the lowest score on the Hope scale for this particular group was an 11, even though someone can technically get a 6 on the Hope scale.
What's a low hope score for agency and pathways?
A low Hope score for agency and pathways would be, I can't tell you right now because I don't have it in front of me, but I can come back to you and answer
It'd be like
that question.
7, right?
Around 6 or 7, depending on the population.
So those are like average?
That's correct. Those are averages. That's correct.
And then, so is it true that the subscale would range from
The subs
3 to
18. That's correct.
Like a low would be 7.
A low would be like between 3 and 6, and then a high would probably be between 15 to 18. And I have that data in the research, and we can talk about that later if you have more questions, just so I can be specific with you in terms of those numbers. So what we found was that their overall Hope score was highly significant and positively associated with grade point average. So it confirmed what the literature said. Those who have higher levels of Hope also are more likely to have higher GPAs. However, when it came to looking at the subscales, only the agency score was significant and positively associated with GPA. In fact, the agency subscale has a high level of significance on the association between overall Hope score and GPA. So essentially what that means is that based on our statistical analysis, there is a very, very, very strong correlation between agency and grade point average. So for those of you guys who are not familiar with research, you may find a correlation between something, but it may be very weak. That means the relationship may be very weak, but it still falls within statistical significance. In this case, we find that the correlation between GPA and agency is extremely high. However, the pathway score did not. So there was no significant correlation or relationship between pathways and grade point average. The qualitative findings. So I separated the qualitative findings into under two umbrellas. Barriers to hope, which are things that diminish hope levels, and protective factors, which are things that increase hope levels. So the first barrier that I found that students reported was either the feeling of inadequacy or not being heard. The feeling of not being heard, is described as the feeling of not being smart enough to contribute to the learning or social environment. Demetrius, who had low hope, said that, "I don't know why you chose to interview me for this thing. It's not like I'm smart, like those Asian kids." Jennifer said, last year when I used to get in trouble, Jennifer identified with not being heard. Jennifer said that last year when I used to get in trouble, no one ever wanted to hear my side, they just suspended me. They made me just give up because what was the use in trying to do good when nobody was going to listen to me? Disengaging curriculum, meaning not engaged because they do not see themselves in the text or it does not correlate, it does not relate to their day-to-day lives. Demetrius said, "I always get in trouble for not listening to the teacher, but I hate the teachers here. They don't teach us anything. I don't care about that stupid stuff. I don't understand why I need to learn this stuff anyways." Gabriella said, "Honestly, I think the teachers are hella boring." When I'm not getting stuff, I just like doze off. Protective factors. Access to human resources, meaning access to a consistent, caring adult. Demetrius said, my dad, like, he's not always there for me, but he's there when it counts, and I understand that. He has to work, he says don't start stuff, and gives me good advice. However, Gabriella says her dad, he doesn't judge me. He treats me like a real person. Regardless of whether I'm doing good or bad, he never gives up on me. Sense of control, which is defined as the sense that the student has the power to control certain social and environmental factors in their lives. Jennifer said, when I have control over my attitude and my grades, everything is good. It feels really good because my teachers and parents always tell me how good I'm doing. Gabriella, who had high hopes, says, I think I've always been able to take control, but I don't feel like anybody can stop me from doing what I want to do. My mom tells me I can be whatever I want, and I believe her. So before I discuss this, I think it's important to note that many of the students that were interviewed talked about adults that were outside of the school setting. And so, in looking at this literature, what I caution educators not to do is not to look at the title of the individual and say, well, that's that person's father, so that person should be doing this, or that's that person's mother, and they should be doing this. But instead, look at the dynamics of the relationship. Because Gabriella, who had high hope, talked about how her father made her feel heard, how the messages were consistent to her, and how he always said that he was proud of her. These are all things that we as educators can do without having to take on the role of responsibility as the parent. And so we always have to be careful in terms of the excuses that we make for the way that we do our practice because something may be going on outside of the home. Because we have the students for 6 to 8 hours a day, and we have a responsibility. And the reality is that if we look at the dynamics of the relationships that teachers have, that students have with caring adults, then it will benefit all children, whether the student comes into the classroom with low hope, average hope, or high hope. And so, after analyzing the data, this is the relationship that I came up with in terms of how social environmental factors impact hope and then how that impacts academic achievement. So I'll explain. So agency and pathways both go into the concept of hope. However, when we talk about the cycle starts with social and environmental factors which then impact hope levels. However, if you notice that there's an arrow that comes back under to social and environmental factors, which means this simply: if you have a student who lives in a socially toxic environment, which means they're more than likely to have limited access to jobs, health care, and attend poor schools, the research is telling us that that student is more likely to have poor hope. So then because of that hope, that student, it creates this cycle where they go back into the community because guess what? We saw that they have higher dropout rates, more exposure to crime, so you create this cycle where hopelessness is being perpetuated because of these social and environmental factors. However, you notice that there is not a two-way arrow between hope and social and environmental factors. That is because I do not believe that students come with a certain level of hope and they decide to use that to either positively impact their environmental factors or negatively impact their environmental factors. I believe that it has to start in the community, because if we look at it the other way, then we're saying, well, Damien has high hope and he's just choosing to use it for something else. It doesn't matter that he's going through A, B, C, and D at home. Damien should be able to be successful. And you often hear that language when someone can identify the one person out of the 500 who's been successful. Oh, but Damien made it. How come the other kids can't? You completely discount the fact that a laundry list of social inequalities that this young person is going through. And so but we notice much of the research looks at social and environmental factors in terms of how it affects academic achievement. But I looked at it through the lens of hope because I wanted to know the why. What is going on? We know the what. Poor people who live in socially toxic environments are less likely to be successful academically. But let's hear their stories. Why? What's going on? And I believe that this concept of hope gives us as educators some insight in terms of investigating how we can change communities as educators. So the recommendations. The recommendations for administrators. Students talked a lot about punishment and discipline in school, not necessarily with those in those terms. That's what they talked about. So I believe that administrators should try to practice more acts of discipline versus punishment, and that punishment only communicates what students should not do. Furthermore, punishment does not address the root of certain behaviors, and as a result, young people may not understand the effect that their behaviors are having on their futures. As opposed to discipline, the intent of discipline is actually to teach a person how to correct certain behaviors. Discipline involves a dialogue, so that it's a reciprocal process, so that the student is not necessarily a directive, but it's a collaborative in terms of moving forward from behaviors that are preventing them from being successful, not only in school, but in society. And then create extracurricular activities. Include students in the discipline process. An example of that would be a peer mediation, right? Create a peer mediation group at the school so that students feel like they're a part of the discipline process. Oftentimes, we as people, we as educators come and we believe we know what's right for these young people, but they live in communities where their code is completely different than ours. Their justice is completely different than ours. So why not include these young people in the process to create something that seems equitable for them, while at the same time teaching them how to take leadership and establish discipline, self-discipline for themselves, and then create extracurricular activities. It's very important for educators and to see students outside of the classroom. Oftentimes, if you just see Johnny when he shows up to school too late every day, he's disruptive, that is your only view of this student, then it can be very difficult for someone to try to want to move forward and help this young man. As opposed to, well, I know Johnny shows up to class late, but also I noticed that he participates in debate club, or he's really good at this, or he's really good at that. And then you recognize, like, wow, this kid is really good, and then you can use that to try to channel try to use that to create positive relationships with that student in the classroom. And then it also gives the student a place to shine so that they don't associate school with, I'm always getting in trouble, this is so hard, I don't understand. They associate school as a place where they're also able to have fun and learn and be successful and receive praise. Recommendations for teachers: share a learning space. It's very important. One of the things that I've seen is when teachers share a learning space, they give students the understanding that we all have equal knowledge here, right? My knowledge is not any more important than yours is. So allowing students to be co-teachers. And also for the students to see the teacher as a student, modeling the behavior that the teachers modeling the behavior that they want to see. Taking risks with pedagogy and curriculum. It's very important for teachers to take the risk and understand that it's the concepts that kids need to understand, but we can modify the content between that. As I said earlier, the students talked about how they didn't see themselves in the curriculum. Well, if you know that as a kid likes to buy tennis shoes every 3 months, you can teach that kid the same concepts using his language than you can using the language that's in the textbook. Building trust and relationships. Teachers can't assume that just because they're the teacher and they're the person with the power, that student should trust them. It doesn't work that way, especially in our urban communities where young people are dealing with a bevy of social inequities outside. Teachers have to be able to come in there and work with these young people, and I'll talk more about that later, how that works. And then community involvement. People have to see your face in the community. They have to identify you. You can't be someone who comes to school at 8 o'clock and leaves at 2:30. You have to be someone who the families and the students are familiar with. Oh yeah, that's Mr. Robinson. Yeah, he was at the basketball game. And then the families begin to build relationships with you, and you build that rapport so you can build a bridge between your relationships with the student and what's going on outside of the school as well. Lastly, school districts have to do a better job recruiting and training transformative leaders. This is so important. Have to do a better job of recruiting and training transformative leaders. Also, I know that what we're asking teachers to do is heavy. It's a heavy load. Essentially, we're asking these teachers to take on the role of second or third parents, if you will. And so districts have to create support systems that, one, not only reward the teachers for that, but also support the teachers. And this can be done through accountability systems and also having transformative leaders come in and train people. So that way they see the example of how it should be done. Because you just need people who are willing. They don't necessarily have to know how to do it, but if they're willing, then they can be trained on how to do it. And so we have to move our educators to that place. And then lastly, increase awareness of community resources. I'm not saying that there has to be a health center on the campus or that there needs to be a job center on the campus, but when the families come to the school and they tell you, well, we're about to get kicked out of housing or that we're struggling, we're not eating, you know, the school district can have those resources available for the parents to access those things. Well, we don't have the healthcare here, but here's a flyer, here's a contact person, you can go and talk to this person and they can help you. So that the school, so that the parents and the families don't see the school as sort of like this jail that's in the community, but they actually see it as like a resource center and a part of the community. For future research, my study had, because of my population, it had a limited sample of black students, black participants, so I would say it could be duplicated with a larger sample of black participants, to interview teachers and ask them, you know, how do you think that you're impacting the students' hope? What does hope mean to you? What are some of the things that you do in the classroom that you believe either encourage or diminish the hope of young people? And then interview parents. Oftentimes, you know, parents are doing some of the very same things that we see teachers doing in terms of diminishing or increasing their hope. And so we also want to make sure that we are providing a venue or a place where parents can access this so that they can see how we can help them as well as educators, because we're supposed to be working with the community. And so when that child walks into your classroom, so does his sister, so does his mother, so does his father. And we have to be willing to build those relationships and know what those families need. See my references pages? Thank you.